Surprise! Don't know if you guys are aware, but you have two brains, and if you want to make better decisions, I suggest this book, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. I am Nick Knightsbridge, and let's get into our review summary. Okay, so section 1 starts us off talking about the two brain systems that we apparently have according to the author. And the first one, we just call system 1, is an impulsive, non-conscious kind of side of your brain. So it's basically the autopilot. So when we really don't need to think deliberately about something, it's on. And most of the days we kind of cruise on this, so to speak. And the other side is system 2, and this is the methodical, deliberate side of the brain that kind of is better with decision making, and it's obviously a little bit slower, but much more aware of things around, and so it's basically not cruise control. Next section talks about how most of the time, because system 1 is working, or we're thinking with system 1, that it doesn't bring in system 2 if it's not necessary, because system 2 is a little bit taxing on kind of our minds. And if anything, our brains and our bodies are developed to kind of save on calories and use as least effort as possible. So system 2 is not employed, and this creates a problem according to the author, and leads to mistakes. And an example he used in the book was the bat and ball problem, that said if a bat and ball cost $1.10 and the bat is $1, how much is the ball? Most people go immediately think that, hey, it must be 10 cents, but if you do the math, it's actually 5 cents, because it's $1 more. But anyway, just an example of how we make problems a lot simpler than they might be, because we don't want to employ kind of the taxing system 2 of our minds. So this obviously leads to mistakes. Next section talks about priming. And that's basically how we put things, or you could kind of call it stereotype, but well, not really. We put words into categories, and I guess it's like the mind's filing system to make things easier for us. Again, probably to save energy. And an example he used in the book was if I gave you 4 letters, so S-O, and then, it was 1 dash, so the mystery letter, S-O, and then underscore P, wouldn't mean much to you, right? But if I added eat before that word, your mind would immediately see soup. It would see a U in that place. Now, if I said bath or shower, you probably would imagine an A, turning that into a soap. So basically, this is what priming is. It's about using the kind of cultural, social, and let's say environmental conditions to think about words or put yourself, make a certain word selection available, so a certain vocabulary available. And these triggers, so priming is really happening to us all the time, every day, and we have to be wary of it, because we're kind of more likely to make mistakes because our minds just kind of put stuff into pools of words and events, etc. According to a sociologist Voss, that was mentioned in the book, there's a priming kind of could move us away from altruism, and altruism, I'm sure you guys know, but if not, it just means basically mutualism, like benefiting others as well as ourselves. All right, next section is snap judgments, and So this is basically sometimes called the halo effect, and how that works is if you meet someone who's nice. Let's say you're at, dinner party, whatever, and half an hour ago you meet someone who's nice, and then, you stop talking, you move on to another crowd or another group and you're mingling. Someone asks you if you know someone that would be good for a particular job or something like that. You might recommend the person you met half an hour ago just basically because he was nice and you guys got along. So this is a halo effect. Now, you don't know anything about the person more than probably pleasantries, some basics. You don't have enough data to say whether he'd be good for a particular position, job, etc., or even as a date or whatnot. But we kind of, because we got along with them and they were nice, we remember them better, and we also seem to think that they'd be good at other stuff or maybe suited for a position that you kind of have no idea whether they are actually suited to or for. So that's that. Another form of snap judgment is a confirmation bias. This is really based on how you ask a question, for example. And if you, for example, ask, is James friendly? Because you implied that he's friendly, the answer, because there's no evidence to the contrary, people are more likely to say yes than not yes. But if you ask, for example, the same question, how's the demeanor of James's demeanor? You might get a lot of different answers. Friendly might be one of them. But if you imply that he might be friendly, you're more likely to get that answer. So basically, the mind confirms the suggestion. That's important to remember. And there are always, according to the author, there's always kind of different cognitive phenomena that are happening and that are affecting our choices, our judgments, our actions, and we have to be wary of that. Okay, next section is heuristics. I'm still not sure how to pronounce that, but heuristics or heuristics, yeah. So these are basically shortcuts. And what do I mean by that, you might ask? And so the two kinds that he's alluded to in the book, and one of them is substitution heuristics. And this is basically when we simplify a question. Example is this lady sheriff? And you kind of give a name or whatever and a picture suited for her job as will she be a successful sheriff? Let's say, and people might simplify, and what substitution heuristics is that they kind of shortcut this question and change it into something much simpler than it is. So the question's really asking if they would be well suited for the job, and but our mind might think that, does she look good for the job? And so that's an example of that. Now another one would be availability heuristic. So this is the overestimation of the probability of something that's likely to happen. For example, we hear much more often about plane crashes, even though there are very, very few of them, than car crashes. But as most statisticians will tell you, planes are a lot safer to travel in than cars. But most people might have the contrary. The other idea that driving is a lot less dangerous, it's safer, because we don't hear of as many traffic accidents. And if we do, of course, they don't get the same press coverage, you know what I mean, as a plane crash. Everyone still remembers, the Malaysia Airlines flight that went down a few years ago, and they still haven't found that. So the wreckage. So yeah, that's an example of that. Next section, statistics, and how they confuse people. So I guess most people don't really have a knack for numbers, or at least statistics. And according to the author, base rate neglect is very common. And what that means is that we tend to forget, if we're given like a rate of something occurring, for example, 80 to 20, like 80%, the example that was used was seeing a yellow cab in New York City as opposed to a red cab, 20%. So, because people have a natural tendency to focus on expectations and not statistics, if we see like 6 or 7 yellow cabs pass by, we tend to think the next one is probably going to be a red one, even though we know that 80%, or at least I guess part of our brain knows, but ignores the fact that 80% of the cabs are yellow. So it's still below the base rate. So we're still likely to see more yellow cabs. And so we tend to forget statistics and just go on expectation. And because the author highlights that everything has to regress back to the mean, so it's going to go back to the average. Even if we see, 4 or 5 or 6 red cabs, we might start to question the statistic that, the base rate of 20% and think that it's actually higher. Maybe it's 50-50, but in the long run, we'll still regress back to the mean. So in the end, it's still 20%, no matter what happens. So people have a hard time with that. Okay, next section is an interesting one. It is about types of memory. Memory is, in the criminal justice system, it's well known that memory, more and more evidence to show that memory is kind of subjective and not very objective. So probably this explains why. The first one is that there's 2 types of memory. One is the experience memory, as the author calls it, and that's how am I feeling right now. And the other type is remembering memory. So basically, it's formed after the fact, after the event, and and this question kind of asks yourself, how was the feeling overall? And this one kind of takes precedence. So when we remember an event, we tend to fixate on what happened after the event, which isn't as reliable, obviously, because as time passes, our memory kind of fades, and so even if it's something, especially if it's something kind of horrific or life-changing, the kind of the hormones and the everything going on at the time in the nerves means that our mind is not so concerned about our memory at the time. That takes a kind of a back burner to taking care of the problem at hand. But so when we do form the memory, it's kind of it's in the past, and so it's not as accurate. So and there's also another added kind of interesting phenomena to that people tend to remember the peaks and the troughs and the ending of an event much better. So if the peak was very high, the elation was very high, even though the vast majority of it was mundane, we tend to remember the peak, and also the trough. So if something was really, really bad, but most of it was okay, we tend to remember that also, that low point, as well as how it ended. So towards the end, also we're weighted more towards that. So obviously, this can have problems when we're trying to remember the whole event or describe how the whole event ensued or took place. I guess time especially is relative in these situations. All right. So that causes faulty memories. Obviously, lots of repercussions, not just when it comes to the criminal justice system. All right, next section is on focus, and it's talking about cognitive ease versus cognitive strain. And so cognitive ease was that, you know, when basically that first memory system is in charge, when we're kind of cruising, you know, and we don't need to kind of make very difficult decisions or learn something new that's kind of taxing. And obviously cognitive strain is the contra, is when system number 2 is in mind. And as I mentioned, system 2 isn't normally employed unless it's needed to. System 1 is normally kind of running the show. And you could kind of consider system 2 a specialist, you know, when you have a problem like your pipes are leaking, no pun intended, you have plumbing trouble at home and you need to call a plumber, that's system 2. System 1, of course, though, there are pros and cons to each system, obviously. System 1 is more creative, but at the same time it's less precise. And system 2 is the opposite. So not very creative, very methodical, but more precise, less likely to make mistakes. And interesting thing that the author points to is how system 1, if we're trying to get a message across, if you promote a sense of a sense of cognitive ease, or if you promote cognitive ease in people, so basically a more relaxed message when they don't need to think as much, and it's repeated, it's much more likely that that we have a positive response to it. And as soon as I read that, I really thought about the 2016 presidential election, that many people were saying that the reason why Trump won was because his messages were very clear. You know, I mean, some of them, mind you, a little bit bigoted, obviously, and now you could argue some of them pretty prejudicial, racist, but they were very clear and they were repeated. He had a lot of advertising money, and so and because he made things simple, it promoted a sense of cognitive ease, you could argue. So and according to the author, that is more likely to instill a sense of ease and have a positive response to kind of the stimulus. So interesting way to think about the last election. And obviously, when you need to employ system 2, when we have when you're dealing with complicated things, such as dealing with stats or new ideas, conceptual thinking, system 2 is required, it just basically puts your mind into kind of an overdrive and it's working much harder. All right, next section is about presentation. And what I mean by that is really offshoot to the previous section, not the previous section, the section on stats. So this, it's all about how we present something. And for example, author used the example, if we say that 10% of people who have offended in the past in terms of criminality, convicted, let's just say 10% of convicts, actually this scenario, best way to put it, scenario at hand was you are on the board of a parole board and you have to decide whether a person should be paroled, so let into the community, or not, whether there's still a risk to society, and it's better to keep them in custody for longer, basically to keep the population safe. So they did a study about this, and if people were told, for example, that 10% of convicted criminals would reoffend, they were more likely to approve the parole. Because 10%, I guess it's kind of an abstract thing. But if you told them 1 in 10 people will reoffend, they're much less likely to approve the parole. So obviously that's exactly the same chances, the same probability, but we seem to have a much more of a kind of a visceral response to 1 in 10. It seems to resonate. I guess people can picture this 1 person in 10 reoffending. But if we just say 10% of, we're not really imagining a specific person there. So again, the same with other stats. If we say 0.001% are likely to commit murder after they're released on parole. Of this population, of course, or 1 in 100,000. The latter is much more likely to get a negative kind of response, and parole is more likely to be denied. So, yeah, presentation matters, and again, it's really based on how you present information. Okay, next section is the fact that we are not purely rational, and what he means by that, the author, Kahneman, what he means by that is that we've moved away from the kind of basically sociologists and psychologists that believed in pure the utility theory. Well, basically, what was that? Milton Friedman was, I believe, a professor at the University of Chicago, and he believed that basically people are rational, purely rational, and they base their decisions on that rationality and their utility. So, whatever is most beneficial to them, they will go with that option. But if I just give you an example here that the book highlighted, you might not agree, and this is why we're kind of moving away from this type of thinking. If you imagine if you have 2 gamblers going to Las Vegas, whales, big gamblers. One of them walks in with $9 million, loses $4 million, and has $5 million at the end of the day. Another one walks in with $1 million, wins $4 million, and has $5 million at the end of the day. So both have $5 million. Now, you don't need to be a sociologist to figure out that the second person is going to be a lot happier, right? But why? They both have $5 million. So it's not just about utility, obviously. All right. So next section is about next section is much like the last section is. It's about how people think, and it's about emotional sway with respect to things, basically wins, losses, things like that. So another example: if you have $1,000 and you have to pay, or you lose, or you spend, or whatever you do, and you go and now you have 900. You're probably a lot happier than the second person who has 200 and then somehow loses or spends 100 and goes down to $100. So they both. But if you look at it, point blank, they both have spent or lost $100. But the person that still has 900 is probably a lot happier than the one who looked and lost half of his funds. So he went from 200 to 100. So if that makes any sense, you look at where you're coming from, where you're going to, not purely on the numbers at hand. And the last section talks about how images are built into our minds to explain ideas and concepts, and we really rely on these images. Great example of that in the book was basically, if someone tells you to dress for a summer's day, you might, kind of think t-shirt, shorts, and sun cream, but a summer's day is often not very warm, and even the last summer day, like last summer, may have been pretty chilly, and we don't kind of think about that. We go to this image we have of a summer's day, and we don't look at the stats, we don't look at the history, we don't look at personal previous experience and think, well, it might be pretty cold and I should take a sweater. So the reality versus this image is often a problem for people, and not least of which might lead you to catch a cold. Okay, so that's it. That's my summary. Book again is Thinking Fast and Slow. Really a great insight into the human mind and making better decisions. It's a kind of a hefty book, but I definitely recommend it.